My name is Claribel, and I'm 42 years old, and I never imagined that the recipes my family once laughed at would one day change all of our lives. I live in a small, sun-washed town in North Carolina, where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever really changes. The air always smells faintly of bread, sugar, and gossip. For the past 15 years, I've owned and run a little corner bakery called Sweet Haven. It's not fancy, just 4 tables, a chalkboard menu, and a display case that squeaks when you open it, but to me, it's the heart of who I am. My mother, Lucinda, opened this bakery before I was even born. She was a woman of flour-dusted aprons, chipped wooden spoons, and unshakable faith. She used to tell me, "Claribel, recipes are stories you can taste. Every bite tells someone's truth." I never forgot that. Every pie, every cookie, every loaf of bread carried her warmth long after she was gone. When she passed, she left me her recipe box, a weathered tin filled with handwritten cards stained by time and butter. To anyone else, it would have looked like junk. To me, it was gold. Every card had a piece of her in it, her handwriting, her corrections, even little notes in the margins like, "Add love, not too much salt," or "This one's for heartbreak days." But not everyone saw the magic I did. My husband, Owen, was a practical man, or at least that's what he liked to call himself. He worked as a property manager and often joked that my hobby bakery wasn't a real business. He'd say things like, "You could have been a teacher or a nurse, but no, you're out here selling brownies for $2 a pop." At first, I laughed it off. I told myself he didn't mean harm, that he just didn't understand the beauty of what I did. But as the years went by and money grew tighter, his words started cutting deeper. My teenage daughter, Tessa, didn't help much either. She was 16, bright and sharp like her father, with more dreams than patience. She loved her phone, hated mornings, and thought the bakery smelled too old-fashioned. When her friends came around, she'd roll her eyes and say, "Sorry guys, my mom's busy with her yeast babies again." It stung more than I ever admitted. The only one who seemed to enjoy my baking without judgment was my sister-in-law, Fiona, but even her compliments were dipped in venom. "You know, Claribel," she'd say, "you should really try modern recipes, things people actually want. No one cares about handwritten cards anymore. You should move everything online or use one of those AI apps that generate recipes for you." I'd smile politely, pretending not to notice her smirk. "Maybe someday," I'd say. Inside, though, I knew I never would. My recipes were meant to be touched, smelled, loved, lived. You can't digitize soul. But while my heart belonged to the bakery, my reality was getting harder to ignore. Bills piled up, and some weeks, I barely made enough to cover the rent. Owen started talking about cutting losses. He wanted to sell the bakery space to a new franchise opening nearby, a coffee chain with slick logos and loud music. "It's time to move on," he told me one night after dinner. "You can't live off memories forever." I remember staring at him, stunned. "You're talking about my mother's life's work," he sighed. "Your mother's gone, Claribel. You don't have to keep pretending this place is sacred." His words felt like knives. But I just said quietly, "You don't understand." He shrugged. "No, I understand perfectly. You're scared to let go of the past. But the past doesn't pay the bills." That night, after everyone went to bed, I went to the bakery alone. I turned on the dim lights and sat by the counter with my mother's old recipe box in front of me. I opened it and ran my fingers over the yellowing cards. The one on top was her golden crust pie, a recipe she'd guarded fiercely, the one she'd always said would change everything one day. I whispered into the quiet. "You said this pie was special, Mama. What did you mean?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something inside me refused to let her recipes die. They weren't just instructions, they were my inheritance, my identity, my heartbeat. In the following weeks, I started experimenting again. Every morning, before the town woke, I'd measure and mix, knead and roll, chasing the memory of my mother's touch in every movement. The bakery might not have been booming, but I could feel something stirring, something alive. Then one afternoon, Fiona dropped by unannounced. She strutted in, perfume heavy, smile fake. "Oh, Claribel," she sighed dramatically, looking around the bakery. Still hanging on to this place, huh? Owen says you're being stubborn again. I wiped flour from my hands. This place isn't just a shop, it's our history. She laughed. History doesn't pay the mortgage. You should let go before you embarrass yourself further. Her words made my chest tighten. But instead of arguing, I simply said, You'll see, Fiona. One day, these recipes will mean something. She chuckled as she left, tossing over her shoulder. Sure they will, Claribel. Maybe you'll make a fortune selling cupcakes to ghosts. I watched her walk away, anger simmering beneath my calm. She didn't know. None of them did. Later that night, as I cleaned the counter and put the recipe box back in its usual spot, I paused for a moment, staring at it under the soft light. My fingers brushed against the faded card for the golden crust pie again. Something about it felt almost alive, like it was waiting for me to notice something I hadn't before. There were faint notes on the back of the card I'd never seen as a child. My mother's handwriting was small but precise. It said, Patent filed 1994 confidential ingredients, enclosed with documentation. My breath caught. Patent? My mother had filed a patent? For a pie? I rushed upstairs and pulled out an old trunk from my closet, the one where she kept old documents and clippings. I searched until my hands trembled from exhaustion. And there it was, a thin envelope yellowed with age labeled Recipe Documentation, Lucinda Moore. Inside was a faded certificate with the seal of the U.S. Patent Office. My mother had patented her recipe. That meant someone, somewhere, had known its potential long before I did. And in that moment, I realized my mother's words had been a promise, not a dream, and that the recipe sitting in my hands was worth far more than anyone had ever believed. People laughed at my dream, but I never baked for applause. I baked to remember love. The morning after I found my mother's patent, I couldn't sleep. My mind spun with questions. Why hadn't she ever told me? What exactly did the patent mean? Could a recipe even be worth money? I sat at the kitchen table long before dawn, sipping cold coffee, staring at the document under the lamplight. My mother's name, Lucinda Moore, looked powerful printed beside that government seal. It wasn't just a recipe anymore. It was intellectual property. Her life's work had been protected. But for what purpose? When Owen came downstairs, yawning and buttoning his shirt for work, I showed him the document. He barely glanced at it. What's this? My mother filed a patent, I said, my voice trembling slightly. For her golden crust pie. Look, her name, the seal, it's real, Owen. He frowned. A patent for a pie? That's not how this works, Claribel. It is, I said. She must have developed a unique process. Maybe it's the combination of ingredients or the way it's baked. He sighed heavily, already annoyed. So what? Even if she did, that was decades ago. Patents expire. You think someone's going to hand you a check because your mom baked a decent pie? His tone was sharp, mocking. I felt my cheeks burn. It's not just a pie, I whispered. It's proof she knew what she was doing. That it was valuable. He grabbed his coffee mug. You need to stop living in fairy tales, Claribel. The bakery's not working. We're drowning in bills. I'm meeting with a realtor this week about the property. I froze. You're what? I'm selling it, he said bluntly. We can't keep throwing money into a failing business. You don't have the right, I snapped. That bakery is mine. My mother left it to me. He looked at me like I was a child throwing a tantrum. It's ours, Claribel. You're my wife. Everything you own is part of this marriage. It's time you faced reality. He walked out the door before I could find words sharp enough to stop him. When the door slammed shut, the house fell silent, except for the ticking clock. I looked down at the patent again, my hands trembling. My whole life, people had told me to let go of this dream, and now the person who should have stood beside me had joined them. That day, I went to the bakery, unlocked the door, and stood in the stillness. The scent of vanilla and flour hung in the air. It was my mother's scent, faint but alive. I ran my hand along the counter, tracing the scratches where she used to knead dough. I whispered, "I won't let them take this from me, Mama." That afternoon, I called the patent office. A kind woman named Teresa listened patiently as I explained what I'd found. "Yes, ma'am," she said after a moment. "I see the file here. Filed in 1994 by Lucinda Moore. It expired, but you can still claim authorship for historical recognition and possibly royalties if the process was ever used commercially." My heart raced. "So you're saying it might have been used?" "It's possible," she replied. "Some patents are adapted by food companies, especially older ones. If it's unique enough, someone might have built on it." I hung up feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. That night, I went through every scrap of my mother's notes, studying the recipe like a map. There was a secret step in the margin. Cold press the butter twice before blending maintains 42% air retention. No wonder her crust melted like silk. No wonder no one could replicate it. It wasn't luck, it was science. But when I tried explaining this to my family at dinner, they laughed. Tessa rolled her eyes. "Mom, no offense, but nobody cares about old pies. People want new things, vegan, gluten-free, TikTok trends, not nostalgia." Fiona, who'd conveniently invited herself over, smirked. "You hear that, Claribel? The next generation's speaking sense. Maybe it's time you retired those yellow cards of yours." Owen chuckled, cutting into his steak. "It's cute that you're still hanging on to this dream, honey. Really. But let's be honest, your bakery barely breaks even. Maybe it's time to think about something else." Something in me snapped. I set down my fork and said quietly, "Do you know what it's like to spend your whole life being told you're small? To pour your soul into something only for people to call it a hobby? You all think these recipes are worthless because you can't see their heart." Owen looked uncomfortable, glancing at Fiona. "Claribel, nobody's attacking you." "Yes, you are," I said. "You've all been doing it for years, and I'm done apologizing for believing in something." The table went silent. Even Tessa stopped scrolling her phone. I stood up, collected my plate, and said softly, "One day, you'll wish you'd believed in me. And when that day comes, remember this moment." I didn't slam the door as I left. I didn't have to. My silence said everything. The next few weeks were hard. Owen avoided me. Fiona still dropped by to gloat about potential buyers. Tessa barely spoke to me unless she needed something. But inside, something had shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was preparing. I started baking again, obsessively this time. Every night after closing, I'd experiment with my mother's crust, documenting every batch. I learned the precise temperature of butter, the perfect air ratio, the ideal rolling thickness. I filled notebooks with calculations and notes. One evening, Mrs. Delaney, my elderly neighbor and a retired pastry instructor, wandered in after seeing my lights still on. "You're still at it, dear?" she asked. I smiled weakly. "Just trying to perfect something." She tasted a sliver of crust and her eyes widened. "My word, Claribel, that's remarkable. This could win awards." Her praise made me tear up. "You really think so?" "I don't think, darling. I know. Your mother would be proud." That night, I wrote in my journal, "They call my passion a waste of time. Let them. They'll see soon enough what time can make when love is baked into every second." A week later, I entered the local Harvest Fair baking contest, the same one my mother had won decades ago. People laughed when they saw my name on the list. Fiona even said, "Still chasing your mama's ghost, huh?" But when the judges tasted my pie, their expressions changed. The head judge whispered something to his assistant. They went back for second bites, then third. When they announced the winner, I heard my name echo through the fairgrounds. Claribel Moore Evans for her golden crust pie. Applause thundered around me. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Tessa hugged me awkwardly, and even Owen clapped stiffly. But what mattered most was that for once, the laughter had stopped. And as I stood there holding that blue ribbon, I looked at the crowd, the same people who'd once dismissed me, and thought, this is only the beginning. Because the world finally knew my pie was special, but they still didn't know just how much it was worth. The day they threw everything away, it felt like they ripped out pieces of my soul. Winning that blue ribbon should have been the start of something beautiful. I thought, maybe for once, Owen would see me as more than a woman with a cute hobby. Maybe Tessa would finally feel proud of me. Maybe Fiona would stop treating me like a charity case. But I should have known better. Success doesn't change people. It just reveals them. The week after the fair, business at Sweet Haven doubled. Word spread around town about my golden crust pie. People who'd once walked past my shop now stopped by just to see what all the fuss was about. For the first time in years, the display case emptied before noon. I was exhausted, yes, but happy. The smell of butter, cinnamon, and baked apples filled every inch of the bakery, and the joy of creating again felt like oxygen after years underwater. But Owen wasn't impressed. He came into the bakery one afternoon, his shirt wrinkled, his expression tight. "You've been here every night this week, Claribel. When's the last time you cooked dinner at home?" I looked up from the counter, sugar dusted across my apron. "I thought you'd be happy the bakery's finally making money," he scoffed. "You made a few $100 extra, not a fortune. Don't act like you're running an empire." I swallowed hard. "It's a start, Owen. Mom always said one recipe could change everything." He rolled his eyes. "You and your mother's fairy tales again. You're obsessed. You can't live off old memories forever." Before I could respond, he turned and walked out, leaving the scent of his cologne and disappointment behind. That night, I stayed late cleaning up. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the fridge. I glanced over at the shelves where I kept my old recipe boxes, every one labeled and stacked neatly. Each box held decades of my mother's handwriting, smudged notes, and generations of trial and error. They were my history, my proof that I belonged to something beautiful. I dusted off the top box, the one labeled Golden Crust Variations. I smiled softly, whispering to myself, "They'll understand someday, Mama. They'll see." But I was wrong. 2 days later, I had to drive to Raleigh for a local TV interview about the fair. It was my first public appearance, small but exciting. I left early that morning, nervous but proud. When I returned home that evening, something felt off the moment I walked in. The house smelled too clean, the kind of sterile lemon scent that only comes after something's been scrubbed or erased. I found Owen sitting in the living room, a beer in hand, watching TV. "Hey," I said cautiously. "Did something happen? The house smells different." He didn't look at me. "Yeah, Fiona came over. Helped me clean out the bakery while you were gone." "You're welcome." The words didn't register at first. "Cleaned out? The bakery?" "Yeah. We threw out all that old junk you keep hoarding. Those boxes, the papers. That old metal tin of your mom's, it was a fire hazard. Place looks brand new now." I dropped my purse. "You what?" He glanced at me, irritated. "Don't start, that stuff was worthless. Half of it was moldy. You should be thanking me for finally clearing the clutter." My breath caught. My chest tightened so sharply I thought I might collapse. "Owen, those weren't scraps. Those were my mother's recipes. My life's work." He shrugged. "Then you should have digitized them like everyone else. You can't keep living in the past, Claribel. I did you a favor." I didn't even respond. I just ran out the door, heart pounding, feet barely touching the ground, until I reached the bakery. The moment I stepped inside, my worst nightmare unfolded. Empty shelves, trash bags piled by the back door, the faint smell of bleach and lemon. My hands shook as I ripped open the nearest bag. Inside were stacks of soaked, crumpled papers, faded ink bleeding together. My handwriting. My mother's handwriting. Generations of recipes. Gone. I fell to my knees right there on the cold tile floor. My breath came in gasps. Every bag I opened told the same story, years of love, sweat, and memory thrown away like trash. When I found the rusted corner of my mother's tin recipe box at the bottom of a black garbage bag, something inside me broke. The lid was bent, the inside sticky with spilled cleaner. The cards inside were wet and smudged. Most were unreadable. I held it to my chest, rocking back and forth. No, 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 no. By the time I made it home, Owen was asleep. I didn't speak to him. I couldn't. I just sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by what little I had salvaged: a handful of torn pages, a few smeared cards. I spread them out like puzzle pieces, hoping maybe I could piece them back together. Tessa came downstairs, sleepy-eyed and confused. "Mom, what are you doing?" I looked up, my face streaked with tears. "Your father and your aunt threw away everything. Everything I ever made. Every recipe your grandmother wrote. They're gone." Her eyes widened. "Wait, you mean all those boxes?" Dad said they were just old papers. "They were my life," I whispered. She didn't know what to say. She stood there awkwardly for a moment before retreating back upstairs. I stayed up all night, sorting through what remained. Most of it was ruined beyond recognition. But somewhere near dawn, my hand brushed against one card that had survived almost completely intact. It was golden crust pie. The edges were frayed, the ink faded, but the heart of it, the ingredients, the instructions, my mother's little note at the bottom, was still there. "Love makes it rise." I pressed the card to my heart, tears falling silently onto the paper. That morning, when the sun rose, I made a decision. I couldn't bring back what they'd destroyed, but I could honor what was left. I took the single surviving recipe, laminated it to protect it, and pinned it to the corkboard above my baking station. Beneath it, I wrote a small note in my own handwriting: "They took everything, but they can't take this." Over the next few days, I stopped arguing with Owen, stopped defending myself, stopped trying to explain the value of something his mind could never comprehend. He saw paper. I saw legacy. He saw clutter. I saw art. Fiona stopped by a few days later, chirping in her usual tone. "Doesn't the bakery look so much better now? So fresh, so minimal." I didn't even look up from the dough I was kneading. "You cleaned out my life, Fiona," I said calmly. She blinked, confused. "Oh, don't be dramatic. You should be grateful." I set the rolling pin down and finally met her eyes. "One day you'll understand the difference between cleaning and destroying." She laughed awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable, and left soon after. That night, I lit a candle beside the laminated recipe card. The flame flickered against my mother's handwriting. I whispered, "They threw away your recipes, Mama. But I promise you they'll regret it." I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But something deep inside me knew this wasn't the end. They thought they'd thrown away my recipes, but what they really threw away was their future. When you lose everything, you either break or you rise from the ruins stronger than ever. For days after the cleanup, I couldn't step into the bakery without feeling that ache in my chest. It was like walking into a room after a funeral. Everything familiar was still there, but the soul was gone. The shelves were neat, the counters spotless, yet it all felt hollow. Owen and Fiona had stripped more than just clutter, they had stripped my history. But I refused to let that be the end of me. I kept coming in every morning, unlocking the door, turning the sign to open, and baking whatever I could from memory. Even if the details were gone, my hands remembered what my eyes could not. Every twist of dough, every pinch of spice, my body moved like muscle memory passed down from my mother. The first few pies I made after the disaster were terrible. The crusts were uneven, the filling too sweet, the edges burned. I cried more than I baked that week, but failure didn't scare me anymore. What terrified me was giving up, and I refused to let Owen's arrogance be the last word on my mother's legacy. One evening, as I stood wiping my eyes with a flour-dusted towel, I heard the door creak open. I turned, half expecting another customer, but it was Mrs. Delaney, my neighbor. She was in her 70s, with a soft smile and eyes that had seen everything but still chose to see kindness first. "Oh, sweetheart," she said gently, taking in the mess of flour and failed pies. "You've been at this for days, haven't you?" I nodded, voice trembling. "They threw everything away, Mrs. Delaney. Every recipe. My mother's whole life." She set down her grocery bag, walked over, and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Then it's time to make new ones. Her words hit me like a prayer. She stayed for hours that night. Together, we tried recreating the pie from memory, me describing, her guiding. She had been a pastry teacher for years and knew baking like a language. Texture before temperature, she kept saying. That's the secret to good dough. Feel, don't measure. We worked until midnight, covered in flour, laughing through tears. And by the time we pulled the last pie from the oven, something miraculous happened. It wasn't perfect, but it was close. The crust was golden and flaky, the filling bubbling just enough to glisten under the lights. I took a bite and closed my eyes. It wasn't exactly my mother's pie, but it had her soul in it. Mrs. Delaney smiled. You did it, darling. You brought her back. The next morning, I decided to start again, properly this time. I rebranded the bakery, painting a new sign myself that read, Claribel's Oven. It felt right, mine, not inherited. I redid the menu too, simplifying it down to 3 things: muffins, cookies, and the golden crust pie. If I was going to rebuild, I wanted to do it around what mattered most. The first week was slow. People came, curious, but sales barely covered costs. Owen didn't bother hiding his smugness. I told you, he said one evening. You should have sold while you had the chance. I just smiled faintly. You'll see, Owen. He rolled his eyes. You've been saying that for years. He didn't understand that this time was different. This wasn't about nostalgia anymore, it was about proving that passion and memory were worth more than anyone's approval. The following Monday, Mrs. Delaney posted a picture of my pie on her Facebook page with the caption, "A taste of heaven right here in town." I didn't expect much from it, but by noon the next day, I had a line out the door. It turned out Mrs. Delaney's nephew was a food blogger with thousands of followers. He'd reposted her picture with a short review. Hidden gem in small-town North Carolina, Claribel's Oven serves a pie so good it makes you rethink what dessert means. By Wednesday, I was sold out before noon. People were driving in from neighboring towns just to try the pie that broke the internet. Tessa came by after school that Friday, watching the chaos in disbelief. Mom, this is insane. People are actually waiting in line? I laughed, tears stinging my eyes. Looks like they are. For the first time in years, she smiled proudly at me. You did it. But success, I learned, has a way of making those who doubted you suddenly want to be part of your story. That weekend, Fiona walked in wearing her best dress, carrying that fake smile like a trophy. Claribel, she sang out. I heard you're famous now. I told Owen you'd surprise us someday. I looked up from the counter, dusting my hands. Oh, just wanted to see the miracle pie everyone's talking about. You know, maybe we could discuss franchising. I have some business connections. I couldn't help but chuckle. I'm sure you do, but this isn't for sale. Her smile faltered. Come on, Claribel. Don't be selfish. We're family. We should all benefit from this. Funny, I said quietly. I don't remember we being there when you threw away my recipes. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Oh, for heaven's sake, you're still on about that? It was years of clutter. We didn't know you'd actually make something out of it. I looked her straight in the eye. That's the difference between you and me, Fiona. You only value things when they're profitable. I value them because they have meaning. She left shortly after, her perfume lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. That night, I closed the bakery early and stood at the counter, counting the day's earnings. My hands shook not because of the money, but because I had done it. Against everything, against everyone, I had risen from the ashes. I took the single laminated recipe card I'd salvaged and framed it above the register. Customers would often ask about it, and I'd smile and say, that's the only piece of my mother's recipes that survived. Everything else was lost, but that one was enough. And it truly was. Because from that one recipe, I rebuilt an entire life. Weeks turned into months. Orders poured in from local restaurants and even small grocery stores. People asked if I'd share the recipe, but I always said no. That crust wasn't just dough, it was memory, love, and endurance. All rolled together. Mrs. Delaney came by one afternoon with her usual grin. "You've done it, Claribel. You've turned loss into legacy." I smiled, wiping my hands on my apron. "It's funny," I said softly. "I thought losing those recipes meant losing her. But maybe it was her way of teaching me I already had everything I needed inside me." She nodded. "That's what real inheritance looks like." As the sun set that evening, I flipped the open sign to closed and looked around the bakery. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive again, filled with laughter, warmth, and the smell of sugar that always reminded me of home. They burned my past to ashes, but I used those ashes to light my future. The smell of victory is sweeter than any sugar I've ever baked with. Within a month, Claribel's oven was no longer just a small-town bakery, it was a sensation. Every morning, before sunrise, people lined up outside my door, waiting for a slice of the golden crust pie. Cars from out of town filled the parking lot, and the little bell above my door never stopped ringing. It felt surreal. Each day, I'd step into the kitchen and see faces I didn't recognize. Families, food critics, even tourists passing through who had read about me online. The local newspaper ran a story titled, "From Ashes to Aroma, How a Small-Town Baker Revived a Family Legacy." I cut out that article and pinned it next to my mother's framed recipe card. The photo accompanying the article showed me holding a pie, smiling, though my eyes were tired. Behind that smile was a quiet disbelief that everything I'd worked for, everything I'd lost, was finally coming full circle. Tessa started helping me after school. She'd manage the counter, chat with customers, and post photos of our pastries on social media. Her confidence surprised me. "Mom," she'd say, "you're trending again. Someone made a TikTok about the crust, it has 20,000 likes." I'd laugh, half in awe. "Your grandmother would have never believed it, our little family recipe going viral." Mrs. Delaney came by most mornings too. Sitting in her usual spot near the window, she'd sip her coffee, read the paper, and smile proudly as if watching her own child succeed. One morning, she said, "Darling, you're going to outgrow this shop soon. What will you do then?" I smiled softly. "I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. Right now, I just want to bake." But life doesn't wait for you to feel ready. Success has its own timing, and when it comes, it brings challenges along with applause. A few weeks later, I received an email from a regional food magazine. They wanted to feature me in their next issue and film a segment in my bakery. I nearly dropped my coffee cup when I read it. "Mom, that's huge," Tessa squealed when I told her. "You're going to be on camera." The thought terrified me. I'd never been one for attention. I just wanted people to love the food. But this was bigger than me now. It was about honoring my mother and the generations of women who had kneaded their dreams into dough. The day of the filming was chaos. Bright lights filled the bakery. Crew members darted around, adjusting cameras and wires. The producer, a friendly woman named Marcy, interviewed me while I mixed dough. "So, Claribel," she said, smiling, "people say your golden crust pie is unlike anything else. What's the secret?" I hesitated for a moment, thinking of my mother's words. "Love," I said simply. "Love and memory. That's what makes anything last." Marcy smiled. "Beautiful. And tell me, how does it feel to have come so far after such loss?" I glanced at the framed recipe card above the register. "It feels like coming home." The segment aired 2 weeks later. Overnight, my bakery's phone rang non-stop. Orders flooded in from neighboring counties, even from other states. People wanted to ship pies, franchise the name, buy the recipe. It was overwhelming and exhilarating. Then, one morning, as I was rolling dough, a tall man in a navy suit walked in. He introduced himself as Robert Langford, a representative from a major culinary brand known for frozen gourmet desserts. "Mrs. Evans," he said, shaking my flour-covered hand, "I've been following your story. Your pie has generated quite the buzz. We'd like to discuss a business opportunity." I invited him to sit. Tessa joined us, curious. "We'd like to purchase the rights to your golden crust pie," he continued. and mass-produce it nationwide under our premium brand line. You'd receive a substantial upfront payment plus a share of every sale. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a preliminary contract. My eyes widened when I saw the number. $250,000. My heart skipped. That amount could change everything: pay off debts, secure Tessa's college fund, even expand the bakery. But another part of me hesitated. This recipe wasn't just business. It was my mother's legacy. I appreciate the offer, I said slowly. But this pie isn't just a product to me. It's part of my family. He smiled. Confident. That's exactly why people will buy it. The story sells. Think about it, Mrs. Evans, your mother's legacy in grocery stores across America. Everyone tasting what you created. Tessa's eyes lit up. Mom, this could be huge. I'll think about it, I said, closing the folder carefully. After he left, I sat in silence for a long time. My heart was torn between pride and fear. Could I trust a corporation with something so personal? That night, I called Mrs. Delaney. If you were me, I asked, would you sell it? She paused, then said gently, Claribel, your mother's recipe was meant to feed people, not collect dust. If sharing it means more people get to taste her love, maybe that's the kind of immortality she wanted for it. Her words stayed with me. The next morning, I called Robert back and agreed to meet his company's executives in Charlotte to finalize the deal. But I had one condition. The packaging had to feature my mother's name, Lucinda's Golden Crust Pie. He hesitated for a second, then smiled. Done. When I signed the papers, I felt a strange mix of joy and grief. I was proud, but it also felt like saying goodbye. Yet I knew it was the right thing to do. When the press release went public, the story exploded. Headlines read, Local baker sells family recipe for $250,000, refuses to give up her roots. The town was buzzing again. People congratulated me everywhere I went. Tessa couldn't stop talking about it at school. Even Mrs. Delaney teared up when I told her. But not everyone was happy. That evening, Owen came by the bakery, his face tight with forced calm. So, you sold the pie, huh? Must be nice to finally make some real money. I didn't look up from the counter. I did what you said I couldn't. He crossed his arms. You're welcome for the motivation. I laughed quietly. You didn't motivate me, Owen. You underestimated me. He sneered. You're not the only one entitled to that money, you know. We're still married. I met his gaze squarely. We were married when you threw away my recipes. Remember that? He said nothing. His silence was confession enough. He stormed out without another word. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, but not from fear this time. From power. Weeks later, I received the first shipment of my mother's pies in their new packaging. The label read Lucinda's Golden Crust Pie, with a photo of the dessert glistening under golden light. And beneath it, in elegant script, inspired by the Moore family legacy. I placed one of the boxes in my bakery window. Customers stopped and stared, smiling, pointing, taking pictures. Mrs. Delaney came in, holding one of the pies. You did it, dear, she said, eyes shining. I smiled, my heart full. No, Mrs. Delaney. We did it. Mama and me. I looked at the framed recipe card above the register one last time. The ink had faded a little more, the corners curling, but its spirit felt stronger than ever. For the first time, I wasn't just baking to survive, I was baking to be remembered. Success doesn't destroy families, jealousy does. After my deal with the company went public, it felt like I was living in someone else's life. Every morning, when I unlocked Claribel's oven, I'd see customers lined up down the block. Strangers wanted to take pictures with me, to taste the pie that started it all. My little bakery, once nearly forgotten, was now part of something much bigger. The company had handled everything professionally. They flew me to Charlotte for interviews, filmed commercials where I shared the story of my mother's legacy, and even featured me on a magazine cover under the headline, "The Woman Who Turned Her Family Recipe into Gold." I should have been happy. I should have been free. but instead, I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home. Owen, who had once called my bakery a hobby, now couldn't stop mentioning it. Every conversation circled back to the money. One night, as we sat at the dinner table, he cleared his throat and said, "You know, I was thinking maybe we should buy a bigger house, something that fits our new status." I set down my fork. "Our status?" He smiled thinly. "Well, yes. You couldn't have done this without my support." I almost laughed. "Your support? You mean when you threw out my recipes? When you told me to sell the bakery?" His face hardened. "Don't twist things. I was trying to help you be realistic. And if I hadn't cleaned out that mess, you'd still be drowning in nostalgia." The room went cold. "You destroyed my history, Owen. That wasn't help." Tessa looked between us, uncomfortable. "Dad, come on, let it go." But he didn't. He leaned forward, his tone sharp. "I'm just saying, it's only fair I see some return from all of this. After all, we're still married." I met his gaze evenly. "If this marriage was a business, Owen, you walked out of it a long time ago." He stood abruptly, muttered something under his breath, and left the table. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house like thunder. After he left, Tessa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom." Those words were the balm I needed. But pride, I soon learned, had its price. A few days later, Fiona showed up at the bakery, all smiles and sugary sweetness. Her perfume hit the air before she did. "Claribel, my favorite celebrity baker." I didn't look up from the counter. "What do you want, Fiona?" She gave a dramatic sigh. "Can't a sister-in-law drop by to congratulate you?" "You're on TV, darling. You've made it." Her words dripped with envy disguised as praise. I kept my voice calm. "Thank you. It's been a long road." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Listen, I've been thinking. With your success, maybe it's time we think bigger. A family brand. You, me, and Owen, we could open more bakeries, maybe even start a franchise." I froze. "You want to go into business with me?" She smiled like a cat that had already swallowed the canary. "Why not? You owe it to family, don't you?" That word "owe" hit a nerve. I wiped my hands and looked at her. "Fiona, I owe my success to my mother, to hard work, to the nights I spent crying over the recipes you threw in the trash. But to you, I owe nothing." Her smile faltered. "You're making a mistake, Claribel. Don't forget who helped you clean up that bakery." "Oh, I haven't forgotten," I said. "I'll remember it for the rest of my life." She turned red, muttered something about ungrateful women, and stormed out. After that, she and Owen grew closer again, united by their bitterness. I'd catch them whispering at family gatherings, shooting glances my way. I ignored it. My focus was the bakery, the staff I'd hired, and the new opportunities ahead. But the more I thrived, the more distant Owen became. He started spending nights away, claiming work trips. He stopped wearing his wedding ring. Tessa noticed, though she tried to pretend she didn't. One night she asked, "Mom, are you and Dad okay?" I smiled softly. "We've been okay for a long time, sweetheart, and sometimes okay isn't enough." She nodded quietly, tears forming in her eyes. "You deserve better." Hearing that from my daughter broke something in me, but it also healed me. A few weeks later, I came home late from the bakery and found Owen waiting in the living room, pacing. "We need to talk," he said. I braced myself. "About what?" He held up a piece of paper, one of the company's profit reports, which I'd left on the table by mistake. "You made nearly $50,000 in royalties this month. Do you have any idea what that means for us?" "It means the business is doing well," I said calmly. "It means we can finally live the way we deserve." His voice rose. "Why are you still wasting time in that bakery? You don't need to work anymore. We could travel, invest, expand." "I want to work," I interrupted. "That bakery isn't a job, Owen. It's who I am." He stared at me, disbelief turning to contempt. "You've changed." I smiled sadly. "No, Owen. I've finally stopped apologizing for staying the same. He stormed out again that night and didn't come home for 2 days. When he did return, he was cold, distant, and different. There was no more pretending. The man I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone who saw my success as an insult to his pride. Around that time, Fiona started showing up at community events, charity dinners, church gatherings, spreading little rumors. "She's gotten too big for this town," she'd say. "Forgot where she came from. Fame does that to people." People would repeat her words, but no one believed them. They'd seen how hard I'd worked. Still, the whispers hurt. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my work. But one morning, I arrived at the bakery to find the front window shattered and the words, "Greedy Witch," spray-painted across the door. My hands trembled as I read it. Mrs. Delaney came rushing over, horrified. Oh dear heavens, who would do this? I didn't have to guess. That night, I called the police to report the vandalism. They filed a report but didn't find much. Owen didn't even ask what happened. He just shrugged and said, "Maybe people are jealous. That's what happens when you get too proud." That was the final straw. 2 weeks later, I filed for divorce. When I told Owen, he barely reacted. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "You think you're untouchable now, but success doesn't last forever." I met his gaze. Neither does resentment. The divorce took months, but I felt lighter with every signature, every court date, every step away from the man who had once convinced me I was small. By the time it was finalized, I stood in front of the bakery again, the morning sun warming my face. My ring was gone, but my smile remained. That day, I created a new pie, a lemon cream custard I named Freedom Slice. It sold out before noon. As I watched my customers enjoy every bite, I realized something. I hadn't just rebuilt my business. I'd rebuilt myself, and for the first time in decades, I felt whole. They thought success would break me, but all it did was show me who truly belonged in my story. The truth has a way of rising just like dough. It can't stay buried forever. The weeks after my divorce felt strangely quiet. For the first time in years, I woke up without tension in my chest. The silence that once haunted me now felt peaceful. The house was emptier, yes. But it was also mine. No more arguments, no more walking on eggshells, no more apologizing for being who I was. Tessa stayed with me most nights, though she split her time between my home and her father's apartment. She had changed too, matured, softened. It was as if she had finally started to understand that strength wasn't loud or cruel. It was steady and kind. My bakery, Claribel's Oven, was thriving more than ever. Every week, the company wired royalties to my account, and the pie that started everything, Lucinda's Golden Crust Pie, was now being sold in grocery stores across multiple states. Customers sent letters and photos of their families enjoying the dessert, writing things like, "It tastes like home," or "My grandmother used to make one just like this." Each message felt like a small piece of healing. I had turned pain into purpose, and I was proud of that. But Fiona wasn't done with me. At first, I thought she'd moved on. She stopped showing up at the bakery, stopped calling, even stopped posting her usual snide comments on Facebook. But that calm didn't last. It started with whispers, subtle ones. A customer mentioned hearing that I hadn't actually invented my mother's recipe. Then another said they'd read online that Claribel's Oven stole a family formula from her late husband's side. I brushed it off at first. Gossip had always been a small-town sport. But soon, it became clear this wasn't random chatter, it was deliberate. One morning, as I was opening the bakery, a journalist I didn't recognize approached me with a microphone. "Mrs. Evans," she said. "Is it true your former in-laws are claiming your famous pie recipe wasn't yours to sell?" My heart sank. "Excuse me?" "They allege the recipe was part of the Evans family's property, not the Moore family. They say you used it without proper rights." I stared at her, speechless. "That's ridiculous. The recipe came from my mother, Lucinda Moore. Everyone knows that." She nodded politely, but her recorder was already running. "Would you like to comment on the pending claim?" "Pending what claim?" I asked, but she was already thanking me and walking away. I rushed inside, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. I opened my laptop and searched my name online. My stomach turned as I read the headline. Family feud over famous pie, ex-in-laws claim ownership of recipe behind Claribel's success. The article quoted Fiona directly. Claribel didn't create that recipe, our family did. She's rewriting history for profit. It even included a photo of her, crocodile tears in her eyes, holding one of the branded pies. I could practically hear her voice in my head, sweet, fake, and venomous. I felt anger boiling up, but beneath it was heartbreak. Why couldn't she just leave me alone? Wasn't destroying my recipes once enough? That afternoon, I met with my attorney, Mr. Langley, a kind older man who had helped with my contract. He reviewed the article. His brows furrowed. She's bluffing, he said, but she's clever. If she convinces the public there's doubt about the recipe's origin, it could hurt your brand. Can she actually sue me? I asked, my voice unsteady. He sighed. Technically, yes. Anyone can file a claim. But she won't win. We have documentation of your mother's patent and your exclusive agreement with the company. Still, the damage was done. Within days, sales slowed. The internet did what it always does, it took sides. Some people defended me, but others demanded transparency. One post read, "If she really inherited the recipe, why didn't her husband's family know about it?" The comments stung. People who'd once praised me were now doubting my honesty. Tessa came home from school one afternoon, furious. "Mom, Aunt Fiona's been talking about you online. She said you stole Dad's legacy." "She's lying." I hugged her tightly. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes people lie because the truth hurts them." She pulled back, her eyes wet with tears. "We have to stop her. You can't let her ruin everything." "I won't," I promised. "Your grandmother didn't raise me to cower. She raised me to stand tall." The next morning, I called the food company and arranged a press meeting. If Fiona wanted a public war, I'd give her the truth in the same spotlight she was using to lie. The following week, I stood behind a podium in front of flashing cameras and a dozen reporters. My heart raced, but my voice was steady. "I've heard the rumors," I began. "And I want to make one thing clear. My mother, Lucinda Moore, created the golden crust pie recipe decades ago. It was her invention, her legacy, and her love. I have the original documentation, the patent record, and the notes in her handwriting to prove it." I held up the laminated recipe card, its edges yellowed with age. "This," I said, "is the only surviving copy of her recipe. It was nearly thrown away once, but it survived just like me." The crowd went quiet. "My success isn't built on theft," I continued. "It's built on memory, grief, and determination. And no amount of jealousy will change that." When I stepped down, reporters swarmed, asking for copies of the documentation. The next day, every major outlet ran the headline, "Baker exposes false claims, proof of original recipe silences critics." Fiona's story crumbled faster than a stale crust. The company even released a statement backing me publicly. They posted the patent records and photos of my mother's old handwritten notes online. The truth was undeniable. Within days, support poured back in letters, messages, sales. The same people who doubted me now apologized. Mrs. Delaney brought me a bouquet of daisies. "I told you, dear," she said. "Lies never last when the truth is baked with love." I smiled, tears in my eyes. "You were right. The truth just needed time to rise." Even Tessa looked lighter. "You did it, Mom. You beat her." But the funny thing about victory is, it's never as sweet as you think. When the storm passed, what I felt most wasn't triumph, but sadness. Fiona's jealousy had eaten away at her humanity. She wasn't my enemy anymore, she was a cautionary tale. A week later, I received a letter in the mail, no return address, just my name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a short note. "You won, Claribel. But I hope it was worth it. Some of us never recover from being left behind. F." I stared at the letter for a long time. I didn't feel anger this time, only pity. I folded it gently and placed it inside my legacy binder, behind my mother's recipe card. Because no matter how bitter the truth can taste, it's still better than living a lie. The lies they spread about me crumbled, but the truth, like my mother's crust, stood strong enough to feed generations. I thought the worst was behind me, but sometimes the past doesn't let go, it claws its way back when you least expect it. A month after clearing my name, I thought life would finally return to peace. Business was thriving again, the bakery was full every day, and even the company was planning a national commercial for Lucinda's golden crust pie. For the first time in years, I felt calm, steady, like the world had stopped spinning against me. But that calm didn't last. One cold Monday morning, I was halfway through kneading dough when a black car pulled up outside the bakery. Two men in plain suits stepped out, their expressions unreadable. When they entered, one of them flashed a badge. "Mrs. Claribel Evans?" I wiped flour off my hands, heart already thudding. "Yes. That's me. I'm Detective Harris with the county department," he said. "We need to ask you a few questions." The other man held a small folder in his hand. "Do you have a moment to step outside?" Every customer in the shop fell silent. I forced a polite smile. "Of course." They led me just beyond the door, the air crisp and cold. "What's this about?" I asked. The detective glanced at the folder. "We received a report regarding alleged financial misconduct related to your business accounts. It's been claimed that your company contract was obtained through fraudulent means." My blood ran cold. "That's ridiculous. Who made this claim?" "I can't disclose that at the moment," he said, his tone professional but cautious. "We're required to look into it." For a moment, all I could hear was the wind. "I have all my paperwork, every contract, every payment record," I said quickly. "You're welcome to review anything you need." "We will," he replied. "This is just a preliminary inquiry, but we do need to take your business records and financial logs for review." Inside the bakery, Tessa looked out the window, confusion written all over her face. I forced a calm expression, signaling her to stay put. As they left with a box of documents, I stood on the curb, numb. Around me, people whispered. I could feel their eyes on me, the same eyes that had once doubted, then praised, and now doubted again. When I stepped back into the bakery, Tessa rushed over. "Mom, what's happening?" "Who were they?" I tried to sound steady. "It's just a misunderstanding, sweetheart. Someone made a false report. It'll be cleared up soon." But deep down, I already knew who was behind it. Fiona. She had gone quiet after her lies were exposed. But silence from her wasn't peace, it was plotting. I knew her pattern too well. When she couldn't win publicly, she attacked privately. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, going through what was left of my files, every check, every invoice, every signed page. I had done everything right. The contract with the company had been reviewed by lawyers, notarized, and approved. There was no fraud. None. So what was she claiming? The next day, I called my attorney, Mr. Langley. When I explained what had happened, he sighed heavily. "Claribel, this smells of desperation. Someone's trying to trap you in bureaucracy, not justice. These cases rarely hold water, but they're stressful." "Can they shut me down?" "Temporarily, maybe," he admitted. "But if we provide documentation fast, it'll be dismissed." He paused. "Do you know who filed it?" "I don't need proof to guess," I said bitterly. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail, an official complaint filed by Fiona Evans. The accusation was almost laughable. She claimed that I'd misrepresented the ownership origins of the golden crust pie and profited through deceitful branding. She even had the nerve to attach fake family records, suggesting the recipe had come from her side of the family. It would have been absurd if it hadn't come with real consequences. The investigation froze my business accounts. My suppliers hesitated to deliver ingredients until things were cleared. The company put upcoming advertising on hold until the situation was resolved. In 1 week, everything I had built teetered on the edge. I tried to stay composed for Tessa, But each night, I'd sit in my car outside the bakery long after closing, gripping the steering wheel, fighting tears. One night, Mrs. Delaney found me there. She tapped on my window, holding 2 cups of hot tea. "Come on," she said softly. "You look like you haven't breathed in days." I followed her into her cozy kitchen. We sat across from each other, the warmth of her home wrapping around me like a blanket. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "I cleared my name once. Why won't they let me live in peace?" She reached over and patted my hand. "Because they can't stand that you rose from what they destroyed. People like that only feel powerful when others stay broken." Her words hit deep. I nodded slowly, blinking away tears. But how do I fight back without becoming like them? "You don't fight with anger, dear. You fight with truth, and you keep baking. Let them choke on their bitterness while you feed the world your kindness." The next morning, I took her advice. I opened the bakery like always. I smiled at customers, kneaded dough, served pie, and as I worked, I felt something shifting inside me, a quiet strength that no investigation could touch. Days turned into weeks. Mr. Langley handled the case, submitting every bit of evidence. My mother's patent, the company's verified contract, even video proof of my recipe testing sessions. Then, one Friday afternoon, I received a call. "Mrs. Evans?" It was Detective Harris again. "We've completed our review. The claims were unsubstantiated. The case is closed." I sank into my chair, relief washing over me. "Thank you," I whispered. "There's more," he added. "The evidence showed the documents your accuser submitted were falsified." "That's a crime. We'll be pursuing charges for filing fraudulent claims." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief. When I finally found words, I said quietly, "Justice always takes its time, but it always shows up." That weekend, the local paper printed the story. "False accusation collapses. Claribel Evans cleared again. Evidence points to malicious filing." People in town rallied around me. Customers sent flowers, notes, even apology letters for ever doubting me. Tessa threw her arms around me that evening and said, "You did it again, Mom. You proved them wrong." I smiled, holding her close. "No, sweetheart. The truth proved itself." Later that night, as I closed up the bakery, I noticed a single envelope slipped under the door. My heart tightened when I saw the handwriting. Fiona's. Inside was one line, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I stared at the paper for a long time. For the first time, I didn't feel anger, just exhaustion. I folded the letter, placed it next to the first one she'd sent, and whispered, "It always goes this far when you build your life on envy." Then I turned out the lights, locked the door, and stood in the cool night air, watching the glow of my bakery's sign, Claribel's Oven. It wasn't just a name, it was proof that I had survived the fire, again and again, and come out golden every time. They accused me, tried to ruin me, and still I rose. Because truth, like my mother's pie, can't be faked. It always rises to the top. The past has a strange way of finding its moment to speak, and when it does, it can change everything you thought you knew. After the false accusation collapsed and Fiona was formally charged with filing fraudulent documents, the air around me finally felt lighter. I could breathe again. The storm had passed, or so I thought. My bakery, Claribel's Oven, was busier than ever. The scandal had ironically drawn more attention to me. People wanted to support the woman who stood up for herself, and for weeks, customers flooded in, leaving me notes that read things like, "We're proud of you, Claribel," and "Truth tastes like your pie." It was poetic in a way how something born from my mother's love had become the symbol of integrity in our small town. But life has a funny rhythm. Just when you think you've reached peace, something else shifts beneath you. It started with a phone call from my attorney, Mr. Langley, one quiet afternoon. I was in the back of the bakery, kneading dough, when my phone buzzed. "Claribel," he said, his voice unusually grave. "I just received a call from the probate office. It seems your late mother-in-law's estate has finally been settled. There's something you should see." I blinked, confused. My mother-in-law? Owen's mother? She passed nearly 5 years ago. Yes, he replied. Her will has recently been reviewed as part of the fraud case against Fiona. Apparently, it references your name significantly. I frowned, wiping flour from my hands. What do you mean significantly? He hesitated. It might be easier if you come in and see for yourself. Later that afternoon, I sat in his office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and lemon polish. Langley laid a stack of documents before me. On top was a certified copy of the will. He pointed to a section halfway down the page, marked in yellow. I leaned closer, reading aloud. To my daughter-in-law, Claribel Moore Evans, I leave the sealed family trust and all culinary materials belonging to the Evans and Moore household. It is my wish that she alone continue the family's tradition of baking. I stared at it, stunned. The family trust? I didn't even know she had one. Langley nodded slowly. It seems Fiona and Owen did. But they kept this will hidden after her death. The trust wasn't activated because it required a witness signature which Fiona failed to file intentionally. My mouth fell open. You're saying they hid an inheritance that was meant for me? Yes, he said softly. And according to the records, the trust includes property, cash assets, and shares in a small regional food manufacturing company. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed. My ex-husband and his sister had not only destroyed my recipes, they'd hidden a will that would have changed everything years ago. Langley sighed. Now that Fiona's under investigation, her financial records became public. That's how the will resurfaced, and since it's legally binding, the court has ruled to execute it immediately. My hands trembled as I whispered. So, it's mine? He smiled gently. Yes, Claribel. Everything she intended for you, all of it now legally belongs to you. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind raced back to the years of struggle, the sleepless nights, the empty bank account, the humiliation. All while the truth sat buried in some drawer, waiting for justice to dig it up. When I left the office that day, the sun felt warmer than usual. Not because of the money or property, but because my mother-in-law, someone who'd always quietly admired me despite Owen's resentment, had believed in me all along. Still, I didn't want anyone to think this was about revenge. So when the local news station called, asking for a comment about the will becoming public record, I hesitated. Then, I said simply, if the truth comes out, let it come with grace. The next day, headlines exploded again. Hidden will reveals Baker was always the true heir. Claribel Evans awarded family trust after fraud case uncovers secret. The article detailed how the Evans estate had concealed assets intended for me, and how those assets were now being transferred under court supervision. It didn't take long before the whispers started again, but this time, they weren't cruel. People looked at me differently. Some with awe, some with guilt, and some with quiet admiration. Even Mrs. Delaney came rushing into the bakery, clutching the newspaper. Well, I'll be. You're not just the town's sweetheart anymore, you're its miracle. I laughed, tears forming in my eyes. It feels strange. I never wanted all this, I just wanted fairness. She patted my hand. And that's exactly why you got it. A week later, I stood in court as the judge finalized the trust's execution. Fiona sat across the room, her face pale, eyes downcast. The once proud woman looked small, now diminished, deflated. When the hearing ended, she approached me timidly. Claribel, she began, her voice thin. I didn't mean for it to end like this. I looked at her quietly. No, Fiona. You just meant for me to lose. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. I thought if I couldn't have what you had, I'd at least stop you from having it. I was wrong. I nodded, my tone soft but firm. You were. For a long moment, we stood there in silence. Then, to my own surprise, I said, You can stop running now. The truth's already done what it was meant to do. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, then walked away slowly, shoulders heavy with regret. When I stepped outside, Tessa was waiting. She ran up and hugged me tightly. Mom, it's finally over. You can rest now. I smiled, holding her close. It's not over, sweetheart. It's just finally beginning the way it was always meant to. That evening, I hosted a small gathering at the bakery not to celebrate wealth, but to honor truth. I invited my staff, Mrs. Delaney, and even a few longtime customers who'd stood by me. We lit candles and placed my mother's framed recipe card at the center of the counter. Next to it, I added a new frame, the section of the will that named me as heir. This, I said softly to everyone, is what love and honesty look like when they outlive deceit. Mrs. Delaney raised her glass. To Claribel and to the women who bake their way through life's storms. Everyone cheered. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the bakery. Lights dimmed, the air still warm with laughter and sugar. I looked at the framed will, then at the pie cooling on the counter, and whispered to my mother's spirit, "You see, Mama? You were right. One recipe really did change everything." As I locked the door and stepped into the night, I realized something profound. All those years, I'd been chasing justice, but what I'd truly found was peace. They hid the will to erase my worth, but fate made sure the truth was baked back into my table. Story golden, undeniable, and finally, mine. When the truth rises to the surface, not everyone can stand in its light without breaking. By the time the will went public and the inheritance became legally mine, it felt like every part of my past had been dragged into the open. I thought the exposure would finally silence everyone, but instead it stirred a new kind of storm. Not the loud, cruel kind that came from gossip or jealousy. This one was quiet, personal, and far more painful. It started with a phone call from Owen. He hadn't spoken to me since the court hearing, and when I saw his name flash across my phone screen, my stomach clenched. I considered ignoring it, but something, maybe mercy, made me answer. "Claribel," he said, his voice low, almost cautious. "Owen," I replied flatly. "I heard about the trust," he continued after a pause. "Congratulations." There was an edge to that word, one part resentment, one part disbelief. "Thank you," I said. "Your mother was kind to think of me." He exhaled slowly. "She always liked you more than she liked me." I didn't respond. He let out a humorless chuckle. "Funny, isn't it? You walk away with the bakery, the name, the fame, and now the money. I walk away with nothing." "You walked away from everything long before I did, Owen," I said quietly. "You just never noticed it until it was gone." He went silent. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing through the line, shaky and uneven. "You know, Fiona's ruined," he said finally. "She's facing charges. She's angry at me for not standing up for her. But I couldn't, not after what she did." I leaned against the counter, weary. "You could have stopped her before any of this started." He didn't deny it. "I know," he admitted softly. "I didn't because I wanted you to fail too." The words hit harder than I expected. There was a long pause. Then he said, "I thought if you fell apart, maybe I'd stop feeling like such a failure next to you. But you didn't, you kept going. And now, every time I see your face on TV, I can't stand it." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. "I'm not your enemy, Owen," I said after a long moment. "I never was. I only ever wanted us to be partners to build something together." He sighed. "You built it without me." There was a strange sadness in his voice, the kind that comes from realizing too late that pride costs more than love ever could. "I hope," I said quietly, "you find peace someday." He gave a bitter laugh. "Peace? I don't even know what that feels like anymore." And just like that, he hung up. I stood there, the dial tone humming in my ear, thinking about all the years we'd spent side by side, me chasing dreams, him chasing control. It had all ended not with shouting, but with silence. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying his words, not out of sympathy, but out of sorrow. It's a strange kind of grief when you mourn someone who's still alive. The next few weeks moved in a blur. The bakery continued to thrive, and the first shipment of pies under the new Legacy Edition label honoring both my mother and my late mother-in-law sold out within days. Customers loved the story behind it, Two family women, generations apart, united by recipes and resilience. But even in all that joy, something heavy lingered. Tessa noticed it too. One evening, while we were closing up the bakery, she said, "Mom, you've been quiet lately. Are you okay?" I smiled softly. Just thinking about how complicated people are. How love and pride can live in the same heart. She tilted her head. "Is this about Dad?" I nodded. He called. "He's not doing well." Tessa frowned. "He's been calling me too, but I haven't answered. I don't know what to say to him. Maybe just listen," I said gently. Sometimes people don't need answers, they just need to be heard. She was quiet for a while, then said, "You always forgive people even when they don't deserve it." I smiled faintly. Maybe forgiveness isn't for them. Maybe it's for me. To make room for peace where pain used to live. The next morning I got another call, but this time, it wasn't Owen. It was the hospital. "Mrs. Evans," the nurse said softly, "your ex-husband was admitted last night. He collapsed at home. He's stable, but you should probably come." For a moment, I couldn't move. The words echoed in my ears, pulling me back into a reality I thought I'd left behind. When I arrived, the smell of antiseptic and cold air hit me like a wave. Owen looked frail in the hospital bed, thinner than I remembered. His hair had gone grayer, his eyes hollow. He looked up as I entered. "Didn't think you'd come," he said weakly. "I almost didn't," I admitted. But then I thought about the years we spent building a life together. That deserves at least a goodbye. He gave a small nod. "You were always stronger than me, Claribel. I just never wanted to admit it." I pulled a chair beside him. "Strength isn't about winning, Owen. It's about surviving. And you can still do that." He smiled faintly. "I don't know. Feels like the only thing I ever built was regret." I reached out and took his hand. It was cold but familiar. "Regret can still teach us something," I said softly. "It can make us better if we let it." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes glassy. "You still care?" "Of course I do," I whispered. "I just stopped carrying your anger." He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "Tell Tessa, I'm sorry." "She already knows," I said. When I left the hospital that evening, the sun was setting in shades of gold and pink, just like the first pies I ever baked with my mother. Life, I realized, was circular. Pain, love, forgiveness, they all folded into each other like layers of dough. The next morning, I received a call from Tessa. Her voice was soft, trembling. "Mom, Dad passed away early this morning." For a moment, the world went still. I sat down slowly, my breath catching. "Oh, sweetheart." Tears filled her voice. "I don't even know how to feel." "Then don't," I said gently. "Just let it come when it comes." Later that week, I attended his small memorial. Fiona didn't show up, she was still dealing with her legal troubles. It was quiet, just a few friends and family members. When it was over, I placed a single white rose on his casket and whispered, "May you finally rest where pride can't find you." That night, I returned to the bakery and baked a single pie, his favorite, cherry crumble. I placed it on the counter and sat with a candle beside it. Not for him as the man who hurt me, but for the boy I once loved, who had simply lost his way. When Tessa came in, she sat beside me quietly. "Is that for Dad?" she asked. I nodded. Every story deserves closure. Even his. She reached for my hand. "You're incredible, Mom." I smiled softly, squeezing her fingers. "No, darling, I'm just finally free." As the candle burned down and the scent of cherries filled the air, I felt a quiet peace I hadn't known in years. Owen's chapter had closed not in rage, but in forgiveness. And that, I realized, was the final act of strength he'd never learned but I had. He broke under the weight of his lies, but I rose under the truth, and in the end, that's the only legacy that lasts. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it just stops the past from owning what's left of you. It had been nearly 3 months since Owen's passing. The house felt different now, quieter, softer. Sometimes I still caught myself expecting his footsteps at the door, the familiar creak of his leather chair, or the sound of his deep sighs when he watched the evening news. Grief is a strange companion. It doesn't always hurt loudly. Sometimes it just lingers like the smell of something burning long after the fire's gone out. But even in the stillness, life continued to unfold. The bakery was stronger than ever. The company had expanded the Lucinda's Golden Crust brand nationally. And for the first time, I was being invited to culinary events and award ceremonies. Me, a small-town baker who once cried over lost recipes, was now standing beside chefs who had trained in Paris and New York. Still, I never lost sight of where it all began. Every morning before sunrise, I'd stand in the quiet of my kitchen, touch the old laminated recipe card on the wall, and whisper, "Good morning, Mama." My grounding thread to the past that made me who I was. One particularly warm afternoon, as I was closing up the bakery, the mail carrier came by with a small bundle of letters. Most were business inquiries and supplier invoices, but one envelope stood out. It was cream-colored, handwritten, and addressed simply to Claribel Moore Evans. The handwriting stopped me cold. I knew it instantly. It was Fiona's. For a moment, I considered throwing it away. After all the pain she'd caused, the lies, the lawsuits, the accusations, why should I give her another inch of my peace? But something inside me, that same soft part that had forgiven Owen, told me to open it. I sat down at the counter, untied my apron, and carefully slit the envelope open. Inside was a single folded letter, written in Fiona's neat, slanted script. I unfolded it slowly, my pulse quickening as I began to read. "Dear Claribel, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I wouldn't blame you if you never do. But before I disappear from everyone's memory, I need you to know why I did what I did. I was jealous, bitterly, painfully jealous. You had everything I wanted: grace, patience, purpose. When Owen talked about you, he made you sound like the only person in the world who mattered. I thought if I could tear you down, I'd finally matter too. I told myself I was protecting my family when I accused you, but the truth is, I was protecting my pride. Every time you succeeded, it felt like a mirror showing me everything I wasn't. I lied, I schemed, and I hurt you in ways that can't be undone. But seeing my own brother die with regret in his heart, it broke something in me. He told me before he passed that you were the only good thing he ever had, and that he'd spent years trying to forgive himself for breaking you. You won, Claribel, but not because you fought harder. You won because you never stopped being kind, even when people like me didn't deserve it. I've sold my house and moved away. I need to start over somewhere no one knows my name. I'm not asking for sympathy, only that you know this. I'm sorry. For everything. If you ever bake something sweet again, maybe save a slice for me. Not because I deserve it, but because I want to remember what love used to taste like. Fiona." By the time I reached the end, my hands were trembling. I didn't know whether to cry or feel relief. The letter wasn't redemption, it was confession. But it was human. It was real. I read it again, slower this time, and one line struck me harder than the rest. You won because you never stopped being kind. For years, I'd been told that kindness was weakness, that being gentle in a world so cruel was a mistake. But that letter proved otherwise. My compassion had been my armor. My mercy had been my strength. Tessa came into the bakery just then, balancing a stack of college brochures. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked when she saw my face. I nodded, still holding the letter. "I got something from your aunt." Her expression darkened. "Do you want me to throw it out?" "No," I said softly. "Not this time." She sat beside me, curious but cautious. "What did she say?" I handed her the letter. She read it silently, her brow furrowing, her lips pressing together. When she finished, she looked at me with mixed emotions. "Do you believe her?" I thought about that for a long moment before replying. "I don't know if it matters. What she did can't be undone. But maybe believing her isn't about trusting her, it's about letting myself rest." Tessa nodded slowly. "You really are the strongest person I know." I smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who learned that holding hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. We sat there in silence for a while, the letter lying between us like an open wound that had finally stopped bleeding. That evening, after Tessa went home, I stayed late at the bakery. The town outside was quiet, the kind of stillness that carries the scent of rain. I brewed a pot of tea and took out my mother's old pie dish, the one I'd nearly lost years ago. I decided to bake something new. Not golden crust pie, not the recipe that made me famous, but something entirely mine. A blend of cinnamon, honey, and a hint of lemon zest. As it baked, the aroma filled the air, warm and forgiving. When it was done, I set it on the counter to cool. Next to it, I placed Fiona's letter. I whispered softly, "This one's for you. Not because you asked, but because it's time." I cut a single slice, put it on a small plate, and took a bite. It was sweet, but with just enough bitterness to make it real. The kind of flavor that lingers, not heavy, not cloying, just true. I smiled through tears. "You'd like this one, Mama," I said quietly. "It tastes like closure." That night, I framed Fiona's letter and hung it in the back office, beside my mother's recipe card and the framed section of the will. 3 women's words, all different, all imperfect, all intertwined. Lucinda's love, Fiona's envy, my forgiveness. Each of them had shaped me, each of them had baked something into the woman I'd become. As I locked up and stepped out into the cool night air, I looked back at the glowing bakery sign, Claribel's Oven, and smiled. Because, in the end, forgiveness wasn't about letting Fiona off the hook, it was about setting myself free, once and for all. Sometimes, the most healing conversations don't come from the people who hurt you, they come from the ones who never stopped believing in you. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the world feels softer, slower. The streets outside my bakery glistened from last night's rain, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and wet earth. I'd decided to close the shop that day, not because I needed rest, but because I wanted to spend it in reflection. The past few months had felt like a lifetime. My ex-husband was gone, Fiona had vanished to start over somewhere far away, and the bakery that once struggled to survive was now thriving beyond anything I'd ever imagined. My story had been featured in Southern Living magazine that week, under the headline, "The Baker Who Turned Betrayal into Beauty." It felt surreal. To think that my mother's humble recipe, written in smudged ink on a butter-stained card, had carried me through storms, through loss, through lies, and into a future where peace finally tasted sweet. I was sitting at one of the small corner tables in the bakery, sipping chamomile tea, when Mrs. Delaney walked in. Even in her late 70s, she moved with grace. Her gray hair was pinned neatly, and she wore her favorite lavender scarf, the one she always said, made her feel like spring. She smiled when she saw me. "Still working on your day off, I see," she said with a chuckle. I smiled back. "Habit, I guess. Sit with me, won't you?" She set down her purse and joined me, her eyes glimmering with affection. "You've been quiet lately, dear, and knowing you, that means something's stirring in that heart of yours." I laughed, softly. "Always, Mrs. Delaney." She tilted her head. That old stubborn word. I swirled the tea in my cup. I thought once everything settled, once Fiona apologized, once Owen passed, once the truth came out, that I'd feel lighter. But instead, I feel something else. Something heavier but peaceful, if that makes sense. "It does," she said, smiling gently. "That's not weight, my dear, that's wisdom." I looked down at my hands. "Do you really think people can change, Mrs. Delaney? Do you think Fiona meant it when she said she was sorry?" "Mrs." Delaney leaned back, her gaze softening. "Maybe. Maybe not. But her apology isn't your responsibility. You see, forgiveness isn't about trusting the other person again, it's about trusting yourself enough to let go of their power over you. Her words sank deep. For a moment, we just sat in silence, listening to the faint sound of wind brushing against the bakery windows. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "What's this?" I asked. She smiled. "A letter I wrote to myself years ago, after my husband passed. I was angry, so angry. At him, at life, at God. But one day, I realized that holding on to that anger was like trying to keep ashes warm. So I wrote this letter to remind myself to let it go." She slid the envelope across the table. "I think you should read it." I hesitated, then carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was old and slanted, a little shaky, but every word carried weight. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the moment you stop carrying someone else's story and start writing your own again. When I finished reading, I looked up, eyes brimming with tears. "It's beautiful." She smiled softly. "So is your life, Claribel. You've done something rare, you've turned pain into something that feeds people. Do you know how powerful that is?" I blinked, touched. I never thought of it that way. Mrs. Delaney reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Every pie you bake, every story you share, it's not just food, darling. It's forgiveness, served warm. It's your way of saying, 'I'm still here.' And that's a message the world needs." We sat together for a long time, sipping tea and sharing quiet laughter. It felt less like a conversation and more like communion, two souls meeting at the crossroads of pain and grace. At one point, she looked toward the framed recipe card on the wall and smiled. "You know, Lucinda would be proud. She raised you to carry her spirit forward, and you've done it beautifully." Hearing my mother's name said aloud made my throat tighten. "I miss her," I whispered. "Even after all these years, I still wish she could see all this." Mrs. Delaney's eyes twinkled. "Oh, she sees it. Every time the scent of pie drifts out that door, she's right there beside you." I smiled, letting the tears fall freely this time. "You always know what to say." "That's because I've lived long enough to know there's no such thing as the end of love," she said softly. "It changes shape. That's all. Sometimes it's a person. Sometimes it's a recipe. Sometimes it's a letter from a woman you've already forgiven." Her words wrapped around me like a blanket. After she left, I stayed at the table, watching the steam curl from my teacup. I thought about my mother, about Owen, about Fiona, and about myself, about the woman I had become through it all. Later that afternoon, I took a walk to the park down the street. It was a place I used to go with Owen when we were newly married, long before bitterness had crept in. I sat on a bench under the oak tree, closed my eyes, and listened to the sound of children laughing in the distance. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of sugar and apples from the bakery behind me. I smiled to myself, realizing how life always circles back, how love, loss, and forgiveness all fold together like the perfect layers of a pie crust. When I returned home, I placed Mrs. Delaney's letter beside my mother's recipe and Fiona's apology. 3 voices from 3 parts of my life, each one teaching me something different about what it means to be human. That evening, as I poured myself another cup of tea, I whispered into the quiet room, "Thank you." I didn't say who it was for because maybe it was for all of them. I took a sip, closed my eyes, and smiled. The tea was warm, soothing, and a little bittersweet, just like life itself. Some conversations stay with you forever not because of what was said, but because of what they finally allow you to feel. Sometimes rebuilding a family doesn't mean returning to what was, it means creating something new from the pieces that survived. Months passed after my tea with Mrs. Delaney, and life slowly began to bloom again. Not just for me, but for everyone around me. The storm that had once consumed my family had finally quieted, leaving behind a strange kind of peace. It wasn't the naive calm of happily ever after. It was deeper, humbler, the kind that comes after loss. When you realize that peace isn't something you find, but something you build. The bakery had become more than just a business now. It was a living, breathing extension of my story. Each morning, when I unlocked the door and inhaled that first rush of sweet, buttery air, I felt my mother's presence, soft and steady, reminding me that real love, never dies. Tessa, my daughter, had grown in ways I hadn't expected. The young girl who once rolled her eyes at my old-fashioned baking now stood proudly beside me, managing the social media accounts, handling the orders, and even coming up with her own recipes. One afternoon, as she piped frosting onto a batch of cupcakes, she said, "Mom, I think I finally get it now." "Get what?" I asked, smiling. She looked up, her eyes glistening with pride. "Why you never gave up. Why you kept baking even when everything was falling apart." I leaned on the counter. "Oh, and what did you figure out?" She smiled softly. "It wasn't about the money or the fame. It was about keeping Grandma's love alive." I nodded, my heart swelling. "Exactly." She paused, then added, "And maybe about keeping yourself alive, too." That last line stayed with me long after she said it. Because it was true, baking had been my way of surviving, of grounding myself when the world spun too fast, of remembering that even in ruin, sweetness can still rise. Over the next few weeks, we began planning a new event, the Sweet Haven Scholarship fundraiser in honor of my mother, Lucinda. The idea came to me one night while I was rereading the letter from Fiona and Mrs. Delaney's note about forgiveness. I wanted to turn all that pain, all that love, into something lasting. The goal was simple: to raise money for young women in our town who dreamed of culinary school but couldn't afford it. My mother had always believed in lifting others, and I wanted her legacy to keep doing that long after me. When I announced the event, the response was overwhelming. Local businesses offered donations. Customers volunteered to help. Even the company that had bought the rights to Lucinda's golden crust pie pledged a portion of their profits to the cause. It felt like the whole town had come together, not out of pity, but out of pride. The night of the fundraiser arrived faster than I expected. The bakery was transformed into a glowing golden space filled with laughter, music, and the scent of pies baking in the background. Fairy lights twinkled across the ceiling, and framed photos of my mother, Owen, and Tessa lined the walls, a tribute to where we'd been and where we'd come. Mrs. Delaney, radiant as ever, was the first to arrive. "Would you look at this?" she said, her eyes shining. "Lucinda would be dancing in heaven if she saw this place." I like to think she's the one who made it happen. She looked nervous but determined. "Hi everyone," she began. "Most of you know me as Claribel's daughter, the one who used to complain about flour in her hair and dough on the kitchen floor." The crowd laughed softly. She continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But what I didn't understand back then was that those messy moments were lessons. My mom taught me that love isn't always clean or easy, it's hands deep in the dough, covered in mistakes, and still willing to try again." Tears pricked my eyes as she looked my way. "She rebuilt this bakery and our family from nothing but love and stubbornness, and because of that, she's helped me believe that you can always start over. So tonight, we're honoring my grandmother, Lucinda Moore, with a scholarship in her name to help other women like her, and like my mom, chase their dreams." The room erupted in applause. I couldn't move. I just stood there, overwhelmed, as Tessa came over and wrapped her arms around me. When the applause faded, I whispered, "You have no idea how proud I am of you." She grinned. "I think I do." As the night went on, people shared stories about my mother and the bakery. Even some who'd once gossiped during my hardest days came forward with tears in their eyes, offering apologies, donations, and hugs. It was proof that time doesn't erase the past, but it can rewrite how we see it. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the laughter softened into music, Mrs. Delaney found me again. "You did it, darling," she said, handing me a small envelope. I asked. She smiled mysteriously. "Just open it when you're alone." After everyone had gone home, I sat by the window of the bakery. The lights low. The hum of the refrigerator. The only sound. I opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note in Mrs. Delaney's familiar handwriting. Family isn't always blood, dear. Sometimes it's built from those who show up when the world falls apart. You've built a family worth every heartbeat. Underneath the note was a small, folded check made out to the Lucinda Moore Scholarship Fund. I smiled through tears. Trust Mrs. Delaney to end the night with grace. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun spilling through the curtains. I walked downstairs, poured myself a cup of tea, and stepped outside to the small garden behind my house. The air was cool, alive with birdsong. Tessa joined me a few minutes later, still in her robe, her hair messy and her smile soft. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, sweetheart." We sat together in silence, sipping our tea, watching the world wake up. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized something. I wasn't waiting for the next crisis, the next challenge, or the next test of strength. I was finally living. Later that day, I framed Mrs. Delaney's note and hung it beside the others: my mother's recipe, Fiona's letter, the section of the will, and now, this. 4 messages from the past, all connected by one truth: love outlasts everything. As the bakery filled with customers again, I looked around at the laughter, the chatter, the clinking of coffee cups, and I saw not just a business, but a family rebuilt from flour, forgiveness, and faith. We weren't perfect, but we were whole, and that was enough. Legacies aren't built from wealth or fame, they're built from love that outlives the hands that made it. A year had passed since the scholarship fundraiser, and life had settled into a rhythm so peaceful it almost frightened me. I'd grown used to chaos, storms of emotion, betrayal, rebuilding, but now there was calm. Real, gentle calm. Every morning, I still woke up before dawn, walked into Claribel's oven, and let the scent of flour and butter wrap around me like an old friend. The bakery hummed with life, fresh bread cooling on the racks, customers laughing as they waited for their pies, Tessa's bright voice floating from behind the counter. The scholarship we started in my mother's name had already helped 3 young women begin culinary school. Each of them had written me heartfelt letters, thanking me for believing in their dreams. But the truth was, it wasn't me they needed to thank. It was my mother, Lucinda, and all the women who had baked love into their lives long before the world learned to recognize their worth. One quiet afternoon, as I sat in the office organizing invoices, I came across an old photograph tucked inside a folder. It was from years ago, back when Owen and I first bought the bakery from my mother. We were both smiling, covered in flour, our hands holding the same rolling pin. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger when I looked at him. I felt gratitude. He had been part of my story too, part of the journey that shaped the woman I had become. Without his doubt, I might never have learned to believe in myself so fiercely. Without his cruelty, I might never have understood how deeply kindness could heal. As I placed the photo beside my mother's recipe card, I whispered, "Thank you for teaching me what strength really is." That evening, Tessa came into the office, her hair tied back, flour smudged on her cheek. "Mom," she said, "can we talk?" I smiled. "Of course, honey. What's going on?" She hesitated, then handed me a small folder. "I applied to culinary school in New York, and I got in." My heart swelled with pride and ache all at once. "Oh, Tessa. That's incredible." She laughed, eyes shining with both excitement and tears. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you. I didn't want you to think I was leaving you behind." I reached across the desk and took her hands. "Sweetheart, the point of everything I've built was to give you wings. You're not leaving me, you're carrying me with you." She smiled through tears. "Then I'll make sure your name is on every pie I bake." That night, after she went to bed, I sat by the bakery window, watching the town lights flicker against the dark sky. My little shop, once a failing dream, was now a landmark. And my daughter, who once dismissed baking as old-fashioned, was chasing her own dreams because she'd seen me chase mine. I knew then that I wanted to leave something behind, not just for her, but for everyone who'd walked through my story. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Mr. Langley. "I need to update my will," I said. When we met later that week, he smiled as he flipped through the pages. "You've done well for yourself, Claribel. This will make a beautiful legacy." I nodded. "That's what I want to make sure everything I've built continues to feed people, body and soul." We went over the details carefully. I left the bakery to Tessa, of course. But I also set aside a fund for the scholarship, ensuring it would continue long after I was gone. And as a final gesture, I created something new. The Lucinda and Claribel Foundation, a small charity dedicated to supporting women rebuilding their lives through creativity, whether through baking, writing, or any art that helped them heal. When the paperwork was signed, Langley looked up with a warm smile. "You know, I've drafted hundreds of wills, but yours might be the first one that feels like a love letter." I laughed softly. "That's exactly what it is." Weeks later, the foundation launched quietly. No grand announcement, no press. Just a heartfelt note on the bakery's website that read, "For every woman who's ever been told her dreams were small, this is for you. Keep baking, keep building, keep believing." The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from women across the country, single mothers, widows, divorcees, survivors, all sharing how my story had inspired them to start again. I read every single one. Some made me cry, some made me laugh, but all of them reminded me of why I'd fought so hard to hold on. One letter stood out most. It came from a woman in Texas named Irene. "Dear Claribel, I watched your interview on TV last month. You said that baking saved your life. I believe that, because it's saving mine too. I left a bad marriage last year, with nothing but my grandmother's recipe book. I've been selling pies at a farmer's market ever since. People say they can taste hope in my crust, and I tell them it's because you taught me how to put love back into my hands. Thank you." When I finished reading, tears blurred my vision. I pinned that letter on the bakery's bulletin board beside the others, a tapestry of gratitude, resilience, and love. That night, I baked one final golden crust pie. I worked slowly, deliberately, letting every movement be a prayer, rolling the dough with care, layering the filling with precision, brushing the top with egg wash until it glowed golden under the oven light. When it was done, I placed it on the front counter with a handwritten note beside it. This pie began with my mother's hands and ended with mine. Everything between was love. The next morning, customers came in and paused at the display, reading the note, some wiping tears as they ordered their slices. Later that day, Tessa walked in with a camera crew. Local news wanted to do a feature on the bakery that became a legacy. I laughed at the irony, but I let them film. They asked me what success meant to me now, after everything I'd been through. I smiled at the camera and said, "Success isn't measured in money or fame. It's measured in what you leave behind when you're gone and who still feels loved because of it." When the segment aired a week later, I received hundreds of messages from strangers who said they'd cried watching it. Some sent donations for the foundation. Others just wrote to say thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. And that night, as I locked the bakery doors for the last time before Tessa left for New York, I stood under the soft glow of the shop's sign and whispered, "We did it, Mama. We really did it." The air smelled of sugar and rain just like the morning everything began. I looked through the glass one last time. The framed recipe card, the will, Fiona's letter, Mrs. Delaney's note, all hanging side by side like chapters of a single story. Not a story of revenge or bitterness, but of rebuilding. Of faith. My final gift wasn't the bakery, or the money, or even the recipes. My final gift was the lesson that no matter how many times life burns your beginnings, you can always rise again, golden and whole. And just like that, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked into the next chapter of my life with the smell of pie in the air. And peace finally, sweetly, in my heart.